The United States government spent more money paying interest on its debt last year than it spent on its entire military. Not close, not almost, more. And if that sentence didn't stop you, it should have, because the U.S. military budget is nearly $1 trillion a year. It funds aircraft carriers, fighter jets, nuclear submarines, and troops stationed in over 70 countries. And somehow, just paying the interest on money the government already borrowed now costs more than all of that combined. But here's the part that should actually worry you. This isn't a one-time glitch. It's not a weird accounting year. It's the new normal. And it's about to get a lot worse. So how did we get here? Rewind to 2008. The financial crisis hit. And the government did what governments do when the economy is bleeding. They borrowed. A lot. Then in 2020, COVID hit, and they borrowed even more. Trillions of dollars. Practically overnight. And for a while, this didn't feel like a problem because interest rates were near zero. Borrowing $1 trillion at 1% interest is basically free money. It's like putting a huge purchase on a credit card that charges you almost nothing. But then inflation showed up, and the Federal Reserve had to raise interest rates to fight it. And that's when the math flipped. Let's use an analogy. Meet Sarah. Sarah has a credit card with a $10,000 balance. For years, her interest rate was 2%. So she barely noticed the payments. Then her bank raised her rate to 8%. Suddenly, the exact same debt is costing her 4 times as much every single month, even though she didn't spend a single extra dollar. She didn't buy anything new, her lifestyle didn't change, but her bill did. That's exactly what happened to the US government, except instead of $10,000, we're talking about $37 trillion. And here's the part most people don't realize. The government doesn't just borrow once and pay it off slowly like a mortgage. A huge chunk of U.S. debt is short-term, which means it constantly needs to be refinanced or rolled over at whatever the current interest rate happens to be. So when rates jump from near zero to over 5%, the government isn't just paying more on new debt. It's refinancing old, cheap debt at these brand new, expensive rates over and over again. And that's why interest payments didn't just rise a little, they exploded. In 2020, the government spent around $345 billion on interest. By 2025, that number crossed $1.1 trillion. That's more than triple in just 5 years. And for context, that number is now bigger than what the government spends on the military, bigger than what it spends on education, and it's closing in on what it spends on Medicare. But here's why this actually matters to you, not just to some abstract number on a government spreadsheet. Every dollar the government spends paying interest is a dollar it can't spend anywhere else. And when interest costs balloon like this, governments generally have 3 options: cut spending on other things, raise taxes, or borrow even more to cover the gap. And right now, the U.S. is mostly choosing option 3, which means the debt keeps growing, which means interest costs keep growing, which means next year, the problem is even bigger than this year. It's a loop that feeds itself. Economists actually have a term for this. It's called a debt spiral. Not because the debt magically snowballs by itself, but because the interest payments start requiring new borrowing just to keep up, and that new borrowing creates more interest, and round it goes. And here's where it connects to something you've probably felt directly. Remember earlier when we talked about how the government has to keep issuing new debt to cover this gap? Well, all of that new debt has to be bought by someone: investors, foreign governments, pension funds. And when the government floods the market with that much new debt, it has to offer higher yields to attract buyers, which pushes long-term interest rates up, which is a big reason your mortgage rate, your car loan, and your credit card, APR, have all stayed stubbornly high, even when the Fed talks about cutting rates. So this isn't just some abstract Washington problem. It's quietly sitting underneath your monthly bills. Now, you'd think this would be the biggest story in financial media every single day, but it's not, because it doesn't fit into a 30-second clip. Nobody wants to hear structural fiscal imbalance driven by rising debt servicing costs. It doesn't trend. It doesn't get clicks. Instead, the headlines focus on whatever the Fed said in its last meeting, or whatever stock jumped 4% today. Those stories are loud, but they're not the ones quietly reshaping the entire foundation underneath the economy. And this is exactly why the situation keeps getting worse without anyone sounding the alarm. Because the people who should be worried about it are the same people who benefit from nobody paying attention. Here's the uncomfortable truth. There's no easy fix here. Cutting spending enough to matter is politically brutal, because most of the budget is tied up in things like Social Security and Medicare that nobody wants to touch. Raising taxes enough to matter is also politically brutal. So instead, the path of least resistance is just keep borrowing, keep kicking the can, and hope interest rates come down before the spiral gets completely out of control. But if rates stay elevated, or if investors ever start demanding even higher yields to keep lending the US money, this problem doesn't stay contained to a government balance sheet. It shows up in your mortgage. It shows up in your car payment. It shows up in what your dollar can actually buy. Because at the end of the day, a government spending more on interest than on its own military isn't just an interesting statistic. It's a warning sign about priorities being quietly rearranged, one refinanced bond at a time. And that's why I made this channel. Because I want to talk about the stuff that actually shapes your financial future, not just whatever's trending on Twitter this week. So if you want to understand what's really happening under the hood of the economy, hit subscribe. Because the biggest risks in markets are rarely the loud ones. They're the ones quietly compounding in the background while everyone's looking somewhere else.